Oof, it's a hot one today. Hi everyone, welcome to Joe Glass Comics. My name's Joe Glass. I'm a comic book writer and creator of series like The Pride, as well as Acceptable Losses, Glitter Vipers, The Miracles, and so many more yet to come. And I'm here to talk about my continued journey breaking into comics so that you might learn from my mistakes and also pick up possibly some hints and tips on how to navigate into breaking into the industry. As ever, obviously, I'm starting with the caveat that I'm a comic book writer, so if what you want to do in comic books is lettering or penciling or inking or colouring, then there's going to be a pinch of salt with all of the information which I'm sharing. It might not necessarily work for you, and there's certainly going to be better tools out there for you to learn the ins and outs of those aspects of comics making. The main things for me is coming from my journey as a writer, so this might be more useful to people who are looking to write comic books. Similarly, it's generally a discussion of navigating the industry and breaking into comic books through that way, however that means to you, and the idea of people who want to break into comics as a goal in terms of working with other publishers. As ever, breaking into comics requires just one thing, and that is making comics. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Today's story is about how we started making the comic when we started. So when I say we, I mean me and my colleagues, Gavin Mitchell, PJ Montgomery, Drew Davis, who were the people I made my first comics with, among some others. So yeah, we are going to be talking about that little start of the journey. Yes, last time we talked about the decision to make comic books, and now we're going to be talking about making comic books. I am by far not necessarily an expert on this subject. I'm kind of not technically minded in general. I muddle along a lot of what I'm doing. That's kind of how it was when we just started, and it kind of still remains to this day, to be honest. I make just as many missteps as I do correct steps as I walk through this path towards breaking into comics. So like I say, I'm just going to talk about how we started making the books we made, and hopefully there'll be things which you'll find useful in there. So you've decided that you want to make comic books, and now the next step, of course, is to make them. There's all kinds of things which are useful. There's all kinds of resources which are out there which are thoroughly useful, and obviously many of them I think a lot of people will have already heard, like Understanding Comics, the book by Scott Cloud, and various other sort of books like that. Generally, if you like Google or Amazon search or anything like that for like making comics books or textbooks, you're going to find lots and lots of examples of ones which are going to be quite useful, to be honest. I've read quite a few of them in my time. I've never really found any to be not useful. All are kind of useful to some extent, and you kind of learn things in all of them. Again, as I'll reiterate again, I'm not a very technically minded person. For some reason, like very technical specifications and things like that don't stick very well in my head. This might be connected with my general way my brain works, but that's a whole other discussion. It's kind of useful to have some of that knowledge, so it's worth reading these books, maybe even keeping a few on hand so that you can always refer to them as you're progressing. So what are the first steps in making comic books? Now, generally, it's kind of a little different for everyone, and kind of a little different depending on what part of the making comics you want to do. Certainly, if you're an artist, the things you should be focused on is drawing and studying and practicing your art on a daily basis, really. And certainly looking at things like, if you are, a very stylized artist, you want to draw very cartoony things, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing life studies, and that you should be actually drawing realistically and studying how musculature works and things like that. The things with like very stylized art is it works best when it's breaking those rules which exist because it understands them and it breaks them. But if you're just throwing it down, it winds up looking kind of flat and doesn't have the energy behind it that really good stylized art has. All of it comes from a knowledge of the core principles of what you're doing. Similarly with writing, if you are going to write comic books, but I'm not saying that you need to learn how to lay out a comic book script, because really comic book script is very fluid. There's a lot of people have a lot of different ways of writing them. Some people write like full script, which is where you literally like describe the actions that are going to happen. Some people write what's now often referred to as the Marvel method, where you kind of just write a general idea of the A to Z of what the story is, and then an artist sort of draws it out, and that's when you really lay down the sort of actual writing and the dialogue and things like that. So there's like many different methods, and in terms of script itself, when it happens, even that is pretty fluid and broad. A lot of people tend to use like something which is pretty much like a film or TV script, but to be honest, there's many people who actually write it as basically prose. So it kind of really does depend on what you're most comfortable with. However, if you are working with an artist, or you're not just writing and drawing it yourself, the most useful is probably some form of script based on the general structure of a film or TV script. That is, you have your actions, which you describe, and then you break them down with dialogue, and you sort of break it down across a page, how many sort of panels you want. Again, that's why it's worth studying these sort of guides and books which explain making comic books, which sort of explain like the kind of idea of like how many panels you should have to a page, how much space you need to allow for lettering, and kind of things like that. So like I say, it's worthwhile checking those books out, and it's worthwhile making sure you know the fundamentals of, you know, scripting in general. But like I say, there is a lot of fluidness when it comes to script writing for comic books. It is very much a case of it's kind of what works best for you and your team. The main things to be bearing in mind when you are writing a script for a comic book, when you're not the artist yourself and that someone else is going to have to decipher it for you, is to have two things. You should never put more than one action in a single panel. That's not to say that you can't have more than one character doing something in a single panel. Certainly you could have like character A is shooting a gun, character B is avoiding the bullet. That is all fine to have in one panel. However, you should not have character A is shooting a gun, running in front of a bullet, and then avoids it, because that's just not going to work. How on earth is an artist going to show that in a single static panel? It's just not going to happen. Similarly, the other thing I reckon you should have is flexibility. Your artist will let you know if it is something they cannot do, or if it's a way they prefer to work. And similarly, you should also be open to the idea that if you send a script to an artist, if they don't necessarily return it exactly as you've laid out, don't like go nuts. Like, you should be open to the idea that, you know, they might have a better idea. Their brains kind of work perhaps more visually than yours do. So like, let them sort of have a play around and like add panels, remove panels, work it however they want to, and be willing to be flexible with your script when it comes to it. There obviously needs to be a little bit of give and take and a little bit of back and forth between an artist and a writer to understand where that flexibility does have its limits. But absolutely, you should have a case of, you know, there should be some wiggle room. Like, your script shouldn't be absolutely railroading, this is what you will draw. You should be open for the fact that the artist might actually have some better ideas as to how the page will work, and then discuss those and be open to them. So in terms of like how it worked with us, obviously the first part, if you are a writer like myself, PJ Montgomery and Drew Davis were, without an artist, you sort of need to write the script. So that's kind of what we did. Now, a bit of backstory. As I mentioned before, the first comic that we all worked together was a comic called Stiffs, a horror comedy set in South Wales Valleys. Now, Stiffs actually had its basis on going way back to the deep, dark days of MySpace. Drew used to write a blog, which was semi-fictional in the sense of it was entirely fictional. Like, it involved a group of characters who were hunting the undead at night while working dead-end day jobs and coming from the South Wales Valleys, etc. But the semi-fictional part comes from the fact that all these characters were actually real people. Like, they were like him, his friends, so myself included, from our high school when we were like young and growing up. And it was sort of like using them as characters in this story. And this story was like at times absolutely funny, but also at times absolutely terrifying. And it was just this really fun thing. And it was really popular amongst me and my friends groups. So like, eventually when me, PJ and Drew started living together and we all wanted to make comic books at that point, we came to the idea of doing that, which at that time was called Zombie Death Squad, as a comic book, which would later become Stiffs. Obviously, a big part of that was completely fictionalizing it, so a lot of characters got amalgamated, a lot of characters had their names changed, and there's a lot more sort of creative license involved in them. So yeah, there was a case of like things really became a complete fictional thing again. So a lot of what we spent was like going over those blogs and then adapting them into a script and into a story arc structure that worked for comic books, and we came up with the first story arc and started breaking that down into issues. And if you think of it as the story arc as a whole, as a 3-act structure, which is like one of your bases of writing, which you should know. Like say, if you don't have to go to school or university to learn these sort of basics of writing, you can just read a book. There are so many books on structure and like how stories are made and things like that, so check a bunch of them out. I might even check a few in the links below, so yeah, check out the links below, and hopefully I'll have found a good couple links to check down there, which you might find useful. So you kind of think of an arc as being like a 3-act structure of a story. If you think of it that way, then your first issue often is kind of like the equivalent to like the first 20 minutes of the film. It's your inciting incident. It's the opening of the movie, as it were. So you're introduced to the characters, you're introduced to the world, and then something happens and it goes off from there. The second issue then sort of builds on that, and your third and fourth issues are kind of like your middle act, and then really your final 2 issues are really kind of going to be your final act, so like where everything sort of resolves, or some sort of semblance of resolution and finality. Now that is of course based on the idea of a 6 issue comic book series or arc. Obviously you might want to do a 3-issue arc, you might want to do a 2-issue arc, you might want to do a 4-issue arc. You could be flexible. You just got to think about how the story is going to break down there, and that's like what we did at first. We sort of picked the elements of our blog which would make for a great first story, and then sort of broke that down into separate issues. And the way we worked it is a little bit different to what is commonly done in comic books, because like I say, we'd all worked in various sort of forms of media study, and so what we were more familiar with at that point was like TV and film creation and scripting. So what we actually kind of did was we scripted it as though it was a TV series. We essentially created a series Bible, which was our overarching idea of what the story was going to be. We then sort of broke down into the sort of beats which need to be hit and the sort of issues that as they needed to go. And then as it was, we then sort of worked out, right, who's going to write each issue. As it ultimately turned out, the first 2 issues were scripted by Drew. I scripted the 3rd issue, which focused on one of the other characters a little bit more. The 4th issue was going to be scripted by PJ Montgomery. He actually did script it, we just never got turned into art in the end. And the final issue, which we put together, because what was initially a 6-issue series was actually then smushed down to 4 issues, was in our ideas to try and finish it, but we never got around to it. The final issue then was scripted by all 3 of us, literally all sat in one room, each of us with a typewriter. God, I'm not that old. Each of us with a laptop and sort of working together on this document. Now this was before the days of like joint working sort of apps and things which you have nowadays. So like we were back then, I think, if I remember correctly on that day, Gav was there as well, if I remember. So he was like sort of pointing things out and chucking in ideas too. And he's the artist on the series. I think what we were even doing was like scripting a chunk, and then like when a new chunk had been written down, someone would like copy and paste it into an email and email it to everyone else so that we can add it all in. So everyone had like a master copy of this script. And these days you could work that even easier. Like I say, there are various apps now you can use which would actually make it super easy. But anyway, that's kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Obviously, that was like the point where we were actually doing Comic Cons. We had a few issues behind us. We're really talking about when we first started. So like I say, we broke down those initial blogs into the story we wanted to tell, breaking it down to issues, and then breaking it down who was going to write those issues. And where we went from there was obviously then the next difficult part. How do we make what is a script into a comic book? Because obviously at the moment we've got a whole story. Like we've got a whole story, it's all laid out, the actions and everything. Visually it's pretty dull to look at. It's just letters on a page. So it was at this point still not a comic. And obviously what we needed then was an artist. Finding an artist is kind of the question which everyone always asks, like, how do you do it? And it's difficult in a way. It's also surprisingly easy. The way we started, we kind of just thought we'll go to Comic Cons, we'll see if there are like-minded creators around, and we'll start asking about some of the artists which we see there. Like there's a lot of small press independent creators who have tables. If you like someone's art, you can just ask them, like, are you open to commissions? Are you open to working with other people? And just go from there. So really, it's an element of you just got to ask. The worst someone can say is no. But also the element that you've got to go to somewhere where you will find these kinds of people. And now, obviously, would be Comic-Cons. Right now, that's difficult, as you know, but it doesn't mean that there aren't places where you can meet like-minded people. There is nowadays the internet. Now, I'm not saying that I'm so old that we didn't have the internet back then. We certainly did, but it was a very different place. Nowadays, you have social media, you have all kinds of forums, you have all kinds of different places where you can meet other creators and talk about like your ideas and like how you're sort of working things out. Just see if people are interested in working with you. Anywhere where you will find artists sort of sharing their art, that is going to be a good place to potentially find an artist to work on your book. In our particular instance, we actually kind of lucked out by a point of circumstance. We got to this point where we scripted a lot of the first arc of Stiffs. We, in our heads, had this going to be a year's running series. And a friend of mine from my master's degree at Aberystwyth University emailed me and just said like, oh, hey, you're making comic books, right? Would you mind if I gave you details to someone I met on the weekend? Basically, she'd met someone at one of the pubs, which was a regular haunt of mine when in my uni days. Had been talking to him in the night, and he revealed that he was into doing comic books. So that was something he really wanted to do. He was an art student at the university, and he also liked horror and rock music and stuff like that, which was like kind of like all the main points for myself and my friends back then. So I was just like, yeah, okay, this sounds kind of cool. We'll see what happens, and like, you know, maybe it'll be nothing. Turns out that person was Gavin Mitchell, who then emails me, and like he emails me some samples of work, and like the work was all zombies, and obviously that is what Stiffs was. So we just felt like absolute kismet. And we sort of got him involved. Like I showed the boys, like they all loved his artwork as well. We got him involved, and like that is how Stiffs was born. Like he did the artwork, and there we go. From there, it was just a simple matter of drawing the book, getting like pages, getting the issue drawn, and then finding a printer. We found our printer initially. If I remember, we just picked up some comic books by local UK creators. Who had adverts on back by a printer that they used, because the printer would give them discounts if they included an ad on the back cover. So we went with that printer, and yeah, that's kind of it. Like we literally just had our script, we storied it out, we got an artist, like say in my terms, like very luckily, but like say we were already like talking to people and like sort of putting reaches out and feelers out and everything. But yeah, that's kind of as simple as it is to start making comic books. You sort of just have to put yourself out there and make your story and just do it, you know? There's just no hanging around, no waiting. You've got to just start making it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go straight to some printer who's going to do your proper lithograph printing for you. Photocopy it. The number of zines and things you see at Comic-Cons, which are just Xeroxed hundreds and hundreds of copies, that's fine. That's still making comic books. That's still proving that you are learning and that you can sort of work on that craft and sort of level up as you go on. The way that will never happen is if you just sit at home thinking about how you could make comics and how you would get started. You've just got to get started. You will learn as you go along. And certainly we did. We made so many mistakes those first few Comic Cons, those first few issues. But like, there's so much that we learned from doing that and from working with other creatives and then becoming part of a community. Because as soon as you make that first comic, that's it, you've broken in. You've broken into comics now. You've made your comic, that's it. You're a comic maker. Job done, end of series. Not quite. That is kind of it. You are now in the comics industry. Like, okay, you might not be that level of the comics industry where you're going to get an Eisner. You might not be that level of comics industry where Scott Snyder's giving you a DM in the middle of the night. That's just not how it works. But like I say, that doesn't mean you're not part of the industry. All you need to do to be part of the comics industry is simply make comics. And that's basically how we started. We got to the point where we just made them. We scripted a story, we found an artist, the artist drew the story when he could. As I say, he was still at university at the time. We got the pages finished, we found a printer, we got it printed. And that was it. We made comics. Next time, I think what I'm going to talk about is our first experiences doing Comic-Cons and things, because that will naturally lead into the much more complicated aspects of navigating and networking and things like that. But for now, that is certainly the next big step in the story of the path into how I'm where I am now, how I'm making comics, and how I began as a comic book creator. And it was simply, I just did it. So yeah, hopefully that's given you a push that you needed. Hopefully that was what you wanted to hear, and you're now shooting off an email to the artist that you've always kind of looked at from afar, but really hoping they might work on that book you want to do. Hopefully this is sending you out there to make comics and become part of the comics industry, because this comics community that we are is a really wonderful place to be if you let it, and we would really love to have you join us. So yeah, see you next time for the next step in the journey on the path of breaking into comics. Until then, I've been Joe Glass. Thanks for listening to me rabbit on, and I will see you next time.